This isn't just a story about a truck. This is the moment one man declared war on his HOA. They thought they could fine him into submission, one ticket at a time. But instead of backing down, he turned his entire front yard into a full-blown monster garage, completely legal and 100% unstoppable. What happened next? The HOA never saw it coming. The neighborhood was the kind of place that pretended to be peaceful while slowly strangling its residents with rules. Perfectly trimmed lawns extended in identical widths. Mailboxes matched in shape, color, and height like soldiers standing in silent obedience. Even the flowers had to be HOA approved, limited to a narrow palette of beige-friendly colors that would not disrupt the community aesthetic. It was the type of neighborhood where nothing was truly yours, not even the land you paid for. The homeowner had moved in with simple intentions. He worked long hours as a contractor, driving a heavy-duty work truck that carried the tools of his livelihood. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was simply what paid the bills. Every evening, he parked it neatly in his driveway, tired from the day, unaware that this harmless routine would soon make him public enemy number one. The first letter came quietly. A crisp envelope was tucked under his doormat with the HOA logo printed like an authoritative seal of disapproval. Inside, the message was written not with concern, but with condescension. His vehicle was deemed commercial in appearance, and therefore unfit for residential visibility. The HOA claimed that parking such a truck in plain sight degraded neighborhood property values. Effective immediately, he was ordered to remove it or face a fine. He brushed it off as a warning. Surely they had bigger problems to worry about than a lone work truck parked on private property. But the next morning, another letter appeared. This time, it was not a warning. It was an invoice. $50, the first daily fine. By the end of the week, the fines multiplied. 50 became 100. 100 became 250. Each envelope was delivered with smug punctuality, as if the HOA board members relished every step of his frustration. They didn't bother knocking. They didn't bother speaking. They simply enforced. He began observing the neighborhood more closely. There were boats parked behind certain houses, oversized SUVs spilling into sidewalks, decorative lawn ornaments that, by written law, were technically violations themselves. Yet no one else received letters. No one else was targeted. His truck, it seemed, was a personal offense to the self-appointed monarchs of the HOA board. Curiosity became suspicion. On a quiet evening, he sat by his window and watched. A particular neighbor, a stern-faced woman with a clipboard, walked past his driveway at precisely 6 p.m., paused, snapped a photo of his truck, scribbled something in her notes, and walked away with the posture of someone who believed herself a protector of community morality. She didn't look left or right. She didn't acknowledge anyone. Her sole focus was enforcement. She was the kind of person who treated HOA regulations like sacred scripture. The fines kept coming. His mailbox became a daily reminder of resentment. He considered confrontation, but he knew their type. They thrived on compliance through frustration. They expected resistance to be short-lived. Most people broke under the pressure of constant penalties. Most people gave in. Park elsewhere. Hide. Submit. But as the envelopes piled into an ugly stack on his kitchen counter, something shifted. The frustration hardened into something else. Not anger. Not despair. Calculation. Instead of asking how to avoid the fines, he began asking a different question. What exactly did the rules say? He retrieved the HOA covenant packet that had been casually tossed in a drawer when he first moved in. Thick pages of restrictions, rules, conditions, and consequences bound in plastic. Most residents never read past the first few sentences. Most assumed compliance meant peace. But as he flipped page by page, he began to understand something important. Rules were only powerful when vague. But when examined closely, when interpreted precisely, they became tools. He combed through sections on structures, modifications, setbacks, and permitted uses. Buried beneath dry legal language, a loophole emerged. The HOA could regulate vehicles parked visibly, but it could not regulate equipment stored within enclosed structures, provided those structures met height, setback, and aesthetic guidelines. Nowhere did it restrict how large such a structure could be, so long as it met the standard classification of a garage or accessory building. The HOA could fine him for a truck in a driveway, but they could not fine him for a truck parked inside his own building. An idea sparked. Not merely a solution, but a statement. The next morning, he didn't move his truck. He let the clipboard woman take her photo. He let the fine arrive, but he no longer felt the sting of defeat. He had a plan, and he was about to turn their precious uniform neighborhood into something they had never anticipated. He spent the following week in research mode. Study of zoning laws, measurements of property lines, consultations with builders. Every minute was strategic. He wasn't just going to build a simple garage to hide his truck. He was going to build the biggest, boldest, most legally compliant structure the HOA had ever seen, a fortress of metal and concrete towering within every allowable limit. Immune to their authority, yet impossible to ignore. If they wanted his truck hidden, he would hide it. But he would do it his way, not in retreat but in defiance. Permits were filed. Materials were sourced. Contractors were hired. The HOA did not yet realize what was coming. They thought he was being worn down. They had no idea they had just fueled the beginning of a transformation that would turn one quiet driveway into a neighborhood spectacle. The first delivery truck arrived at dawn. Pallets of steel beams and corrugated panels filled the street. Neighbors peeked through curtains, concerned. HOA board members shuffled in confusion. They watched, waiting for an opportunity to intervene, but every piece of paperwork was in order. Every guideline was followed. Every legal box checked. They couldn't stop it. They could only watch. The foundation was laid. Posts anchored. Walls lifted. Every day, the sound of construction echoed, a declaration of rebellion forged in concrete and steel, and as the structure rose higher, so did the panic of those who once felt untouchable. The HOA had started a war, but he was about to finish it. Construction began in full force, turning what was once an unremarkable suburban front yard into a scene of industrial upheaval. The neighborhood, once defined by its silence and symmetry, now echoed with the grind of drills and the clang of steel. Each sunrise brought more materials, more workers, more progress. The HOA board members, who once strutted with confidence, now hovered at a cautious distance, clutching their clipboards like shields against inevitable disaster. Every detail of the build was intentional. The foundation wasn't a mere slab, but a reinforced pad designed to support extreme weight loads. The pillars were oversized, not out of necessity but audacity. Each metal beam stood like a challenge, hammered into place with the precision of someone who didn't just want shelter, but a statement. The roof extended higher than any structure on the street, yet never exceeded the legal maximum set by local zoning. The walls were clad in industrial-grade panels, sleek and impressive rather than unsightly, leaving no room for subjective complaints about aesthetic disruption. Neighbors whispered in growing fascination. Some admired, others feared, but all watched. Families on morning walks slowed their pace, eyes fixed on the skeletal framework stretching skyward. Dogs paused mid-bark. Joggers forgot their routes. Everyone knew something historic was happening, though none dared speak it aloud where HOA ears could hear. The clipboard woman made frequent appearances, pacing at the property line like a guard dog restrained by invisible chains. Her eyes scanned for violations with desperate intensity, hoping for even the smallest infraction to weaponize. She called the county inspector twice, yet both times he reviewed the permits, nodded with professional neutrality, and left without action. Her frustration swelled visibly, tightening her posture and reddening her cheeks. Within days, rumors spread. Some claimed it would be a private workshop. Others insisted it was a full commercial facility secretly disguised. A few dramatic voices even suggested he was preparing for doomsday. Yet the truth was simpler and far more infuriating to the HOA. He was exercising his rights to their fullest extent, something they had never anticipated. By the end of the second week, the skeleton became a shell. The roof was sealed. The concrete floor cured to a perfect sheen. Electrical lines were routed discreetly underground. Motion-activated lights were installed above the wide steel doors, illuminating the structure like a monument at night. It towered over every house in sight, not by outlawing the rules, but by mastering them. The HOA scrambled into emergency meetings. Their collective composure cracked as they argued amongst themselves behind closed blinds. They attempted to label the build as unsightly, only to be reminded that aesthetics could not override legally approved permits. They attempted to claim it violated community standards, only to be countered with photographic evidence of sheds and detached garages throughout the neighborhood. They attempted to enforce retroactive restrictions, only to learn that legal changes could not be applied to already permitted structures. Powerless but unwilling to concede defeat, they shifted to psychological warfare. Letters changed tone, no longer civil or formal but passive-aggressive. They expressed concern for neighborhood harmony, hinted at negative property value consequences, and warned of future litigation if disruptions occurred. Yet every letter met silence. He didn't respond with words. He responded with progress. Once the exterior was complete, he turned his attention inward. The interior was not merely functional, it was engineered excellence. Tool racks lined the walls in precise symmetry. Overhead pulleys and mounted lifts created the ability to raise entire vehicles with ease. Air compressors, welding stations, tire machines, and storage lockers were installed with military precision. Every bolt tightened with purpose, every wire concealed meticulously. It was no longer a garage, it was an empire. And soon, it would be undeniable. The day the massive rolling doors were installed, the neighborhood collectively held its breath. The doors slid into place with a thunderous rumble, sealing the structure like a vault. As the mechanism clicked shut, it resonated with finality. The truck, the simple work vehicle that had sparked all of this, was driven inside. Its engine echoed through the aluminum walls like a battle cry. For the first time since the war began, it disappeared from public sight. Technically, the HOA had succeeded in its demand. The truck was no longer visible. But in achieving that win, they had enabled something far greater than they imagined. They had taken issue with one vehicle and created a fortress capable of housing 10. They had waged war against inconvenience and birthed legend. The clipboard woman stood across the street that evening, staring with undisguised resentment. Her power had not been taken by force. It had been dissolved by legality. Her letters now seemed weak relics of a past era when threats held weight. The structure stood like a mirror, reflecting her failure in metallic brilliance. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. Passers-by slowed to stare. Local contractors stopped to admire. Even property investors took an interest, recognizing ingenuity when they saw it. What was built in rebellion became a beacon of capability. It was no longer just a garage. It was proof that authority could be challenged and defeated without breaking rules. But the HOA was not finished. Their pride would not allow surrender. If they could not destroy the structure, they would attempt to destroy the man behind it. They would seek new angles, new technicalities, new campaigns of irritation, yet he had anticipated this. The truck was secure. The fortress stood. And with the physical battle won, he now prepared for the strategic one that would follow, not with construction, but with exposure. The HOA had made themselves enemies of the wrong man, and he was about to make sure the world knew it. The structure now dominated the street like a monument to defiance, but monuments invite challenge. The HOA, wounded in pride and stripped of immediate control, retreated not in defeat, but in recalculated malice. Like an enemy forced to abandon the battlefield, they turned to guerrilla tactics, quiet, indirect, and persistent. The first move came not as a letter, but as silence. The daily fines stopped, replaced by an unnatural calm. For a week, no envelopes arrived. No board members patrolled. No new threats slipped under doors. It was the kind of quiet that suggested not peace, but planning. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. He expected resistance, but he did not expect the scale of it. One morning, as he stepped outside to begin his work, a county vehicle pulled up, not for inspection, but investigation. The official introduced himself with a stiff posture and cautious politeness. He wasn't interested in the garage. He was there for something else. A complaint had been filed. not by name, but by someone concerned about potential unlicensed business activity operating from residential property. The accusation was vague enough to warrant inquiry, but pointed enough to expose intent. The HOA couldn't stop the building. Now they were trying to stop its use. The investigator asked questions. Had commercial services been advertised? Were customers arriving on site? Were there signs indicating a public enterprise? Each time the answer was no, not just spoken but proven. There were no ads, no business listings, no transactions on site. The building was private storage, legal and indisputable. The official left with no cause for action, but not without leaving a warning. More complaints could trigger further reviews. If malicious reports continued, the county would be forced to pursue deeper scrutiny. It wasn't a threat from him, it was a reminder of the system. One that could be used like a weapon in the wrong hands, and the HOA had many hands. Within days, the next wave arrived. Trash violations. Noise complaints. Reports of suspicious activity at night. Claims that unknown vehicles were parked near the home. Even accusations that lights from the structure were blinding and disruptive to nearby residents. One by one, minor issues materialized from thin air, each requiring some response, some clarification, some proof of innocence. It was not about winning a case, it was about wearing him down. They were not attacking with force. They were attacking with paperwork. The clipboard woman resumed her patrols, no longer just observing but photographing every inch of his property. Whatever she couldn't find, she invented. Her posture was no longer triumphant. It was rabid. The HOA board had declared quiet war, and she was their frontline soldier. But every attack brought more resolve. Instead of reacting with frustration, he documented everything. He created meticulous logs of every visit, every complaint, every letter. He installed cameras, not for protection but for evidence. Every encounter was recorded. Every baseless accusation was archived. Every overreach was preserved like ammunition, because he now understood something critical. This wasn't just about him anymore. His structure had become a beacon to others in the neighborhood. Neighbors who once tiptoed around the HOA now approached him in private, some curious, some admiring, some whispering stories of their own grievances. Fines for faded paint, threats over mailbox designs, warnings for seasonal decorations deemed too excessive. The HOA had ruled like tyrants, but no one had dared stand against them until now, and with the monster garage as his fortress, he found himself becoming something unexpected, a symbol. He didn't seek followers, but they came regardless. Quiet nods from passing joggers, thumbs up from delivery drivers. Even a few lawn chairs appeared across the street, as if someone had decided it was worth sitting down to watch the unfolding drama like a live show. But admiration wasn't enough. He needed action. The HOA relied on fear and silence. To beat them, he needed exposure. The idea formed slowly, then sharpened into certainty. If they wanted to bury him in complaints, he would bury them in truth. But not by shouting, not by arguing, by documenting. He built a website, anonymous, clean, professional, a simple blog-style layout titled HOA Chronicles When Power Goes Too Far. The first post told his story, not in exaggeration, but in sequence. He uploaded photos of the letters, screenshots of fines, video clips of the clipboard woman stalking the driveway, scans of the legal loophole he used to win. Then came the second post, where others could submit their own HOA horror stories anonymously. Within 48 hours, the inbox is filled. Within 72 hours, the site exploded across homeowner forums. Within a week, local news reporters reached out. The HOA board panicked. They held emergency meetings. They sent cease and desist letters. They claimed defamation, harassment, and false representation. Yet none of their accusations held. Everything posted was factual, documented, and legally protected as public record or personal account. Their own rules, so heavily relied upon to restrain others, were now restraining them. And for the first time since the war began, they were losing control of the narrative. But the battle was far from over. Embarrassed and enraged, they sought a new angle, not through county officials, not through fines or letters, but through the one avenue left untouched. They would try to turn the neighborhood against him, and when that failed, they would aim higher, not at the building, not at the truck, but at his right to stay in the neighborhood at all. The HOA had lost ground, but not its appetite for control. Their embarrassment over the failed complaints and the viral website festered into something darker. They could no longer attack the structure directly, nor silence the exposure spreading online. So they shifted strategy. If they couldn't tear down his garage, they would tear down his reputation. The campaign began subtly. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, anonymous but unmistakably written in HOA rhetoric. They warned that a rogue homeowner was damaging property values with an oversized commercial eyesore. They suggested he was planning to operate an unlicensed business, bringing noise, traffic, and danger. The message was clear. He wasn't just defying the HOA, he was endangering the neighborhood. Some residents read the flyers and tossed them immediately. Others paused, uneasy. Fear works best in silence, and the HOA knew it. They wanted neighbors to whisper, to speculate, to let doubt grow like mold in corners where truth rarely reached. But whispers have a way of splitting communities. One evening, lawn chairs appeared not across the street in quiet solidarity, but in opposition. A few neighbors gathered at the corner, shaking their heads, gesturing toward the towering structure. Their voices, though muffled, carried resentment. They didn't care about legality. They didn't care about loopholes. They cared only about appearances, and appearances were no longer symmetrical. Yet just as resentment took root, loyalty grew beside it. Families who had endured years of petty fines saw him as a figurehead for their own frustrations. They defended him in conversations, supported him online, and even shared their own stories on his website. His fight wasn't just his anymore, it was becoming collective. The HOA hadn't divided the neighborhood. They had fractured it. Two camps emerged, those who bowed to the board's authority and those who saw the board for what it truly was. The board, unsettled by this split, doubled down. They escalated from flyers to intimidation. Late-night knocks rattled his door, though no one waited outside. Strange phone calls interrupted his evenings, the line silent except for faint breathing before clicks ended the call. Even petty vandalism appeared, scratches on his mailbox, tire tracks across his lawn, trash dumped at the edge of his driveway. Each act was small enough to deny responsibility, but together they formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. Yet he didn't bend. He documented everything. He installed more cameras, logged every incident, and added each new attack to the growing archive on his website. What was meant to frighten him only strengthened his evidence. The HOA board couldn't see it yet, but they were building their own noose, one petty act at a time. Still, the pressure mounted. The board launched an official campaign to amend the HOA bylaws. Their proposal, a new restriction on non-standard accessory structures. It was a transparent attempt to outlaw what was already standing. They couldn't apply it retroactively without risking legal retaliation, but their hope was to rally the neighborhood into support, framing him as the cause of the new rule. Signs appeared at intersections urging residents to protect property values, vote yes. Meetings grew crowded, tempers flared, voices rose. The HOA board stood at the front, painting themselves as guardians of order, while behind them, the clipboard woman glared with a mixture of obsession and hatred. But the vote didn't go as planned. For every voice raised against him, another spoke in his defense. Residents who had long remained silent came forward, recounting years of unjust fines and intimidation. His story had lit a fire, and now it spread through the community like a controlled burn. People weren't just defending his garage. They were exposing the rot at the HOA's core. The final vote came close. Too close! The new rule failed by only a handful of ballots. The board stood frozen in disbelief as cheers erupted from the back of the room. The division was no longer subtle. It was open rebellion. That night he stood outside his garage under the glow of the motion lights. For the first time since the war began, he felt not just defiance, but hope. The HOA was bleeding power. Their grip was slipping. Their authority was cracking, but he also knew desperation makes the corner dangerous. The board wouldn't stop. They couldn't. Too much pride, too much ego, too much invested in control. If they couldn't beat him with fines, with laws, with intimidation, with reputation, there was only one move left. They would try to remove him entirely. The HOA would attempt the ultimate weapon, foreclosure. The war had escalated from petty fines to political division, from intimidation to organized resistance. But the HOA board, cornered and humiliated, reached for the last and most devastating weapon available to their kind: legal annihilation. If they could not stop his garage, could not silence his voice, and could not sway his neighbors, then they would try to erase him completely, not through persuasion, not through rules, but through force disguised as law. It began with a formal notice delivered not by mail, but by courier. A thick envelope sealed with legal letterhead stamped with urgency. Inside was not a warning, not a fine, but a demand. The HOA claimed unpaid penalties from the earliest days of the dispute, fines he had long ignored, believing them invalid after he proved compliance through his structure. But the board had never officially voided them. Instead, they had quietly accumulated them in their records, compounding them daily with interest. The sum was staggering. Thousands of dollars, not in damages, not in repair costs, but in paper penalties they had manufactured. Buried in legal wording was the threat. Failure to pay would authorize the HOA to place a lien on his property, and if the lien remained unresolved, foreclosure proceedings could begin. They had never intended to win through argument. They intended to win through exhaustion. For a moment, even he felt the weight of it. Not fear, but calculation. A lien was serious. Foreclosure was warfare. They were no longer playing neighborhood politics. They were reaching into his life, his livelihood, his home. They wanted not correction, but removal. Yet unlike most homeowners who received such threats, he was prepared. He pulled out every recorded letter, every logged incident, every photograph and time-stamped video. He compiled them into organized folders. He indexed digital copies. He built not a defense but a case. The fines they claimed were never legitimate. He had constructed the garage in full compliance before enforcement, yet they had continued to levy penalties after the matter was resolved. This wasn't a regulation. It was extortion under the guise of procedure. He hired legal counsel, not a meek negotiator, but a litigator who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Together, they drafted a formal response. It didn't beg for leniency. It didn't request negotiation. It accused. The HOA was charged with malicious enforcement, harassment, negligence of duty, reckless misrepresentation of fines, and financial coercion. Attached were demands for compensatory damages and court fees. The letter wasn't mailed. It was served directly to each board member's home. The reaction was immediate. The clipboard woman, once confident and untouchable, was seen pacing her front porch in frantic circles. Another board member, a man known for his smugness during meetings, ripped the notice in half in his driveway, only to retrieve the pieces seconds later, realizing destruction wouldn't erase consequence. Calls flew between board members late into the night. Lights burned in the HOA headquarters long past midnight. They had overplayed their hand. The foreclosure threat was meant to frighten him into compliance. Instead, it exposed them to liability. If they pursued legal action, they would be forced into open court, where everything would become public record. The website would explode with credibility. News stations would swarm for coverage. Their cushioned authority would be dissected under legal scrutiny. The HOA board met in emergency session. Though he wasn't there, he could imagine the mood. Panic mixed with denial, pride battling self-preservation. They debated whether to continue or retreat. They weighed victory against exposure. They realized something they had refused to acknowledge until that moment. He wasn't afraid of them. He was waiting for them. Days passed without response. No letters, no knocks, no complaints. The silence this time was different. Before, it carried a threat. Now, it hinted at collapse. Then came the final sign. A notice appeared on each resident's door, not from the HOA board, but from the property management company that facilitated their operations. Effective immediately, the company was terminating its contract with the HOA, citing unprofessional conduct, mismanagement of member resources, and potential legal risks. The board had not only lost their battle, they had lost their infrastructure, but victory was not yet claimed. Wounded animals still bite. The board could still attempt one last maneuver, a vote to dissolve, a desperate plea to rewrite history, or a final act of retaliation born from ego rather than strategy. He remained vigilant, because the war had shifted once more. It was no longer about his truck, no longer about his garage, no longer even about him. It had become a referendum on power itself. The question was no longer whether he would win. It was whether the HOA would die fighting or die defeated. The neighborhood was no longer quiet, not in sound but in energy. There was a tension in the air, not of fear but of anticipation. The residents sensed it. The board members felt it. The war was drawing to an end, and the question was no longer whether change was coming, but what form it would take. The HOA board, suffocating under mounting pressure, called one final emergency meeting. Notices were delivered, not with arrogance as before, but with urgency. The meeting would determine not just policy, but survival. He didn't attend. He didn't need to. His presence was already felt without stepping through the doors. His case, his website, his defiance, all of it loomed over the proceedings like an uninvited guest seated at every table. Inside, the board presented its last defense. They tried to portray themselves as misunderstood protectors of order. They claimed the garage controversy had been blown out of proportion. They insisted fines were issued in good faith. But their composure was fractured. Their voices trembled. Their certainty had evaporated. The residents were no longer silent. One by one they stood, not with outrage but with exhaustion. People who had once complied now confessed their grievances openly. Fines for lawn lengths, threats over flower pots, warnings for holiday decorations. The board had ruled through intimidation for years, and now their record was bleeding into the open. There was no rage, no shouting, just a slow, steady stripping away of their authority through truth. Then, the motion was made, a full vote to remove the existing HOA board. Hands raised, not in hesitation, but with finality. The vote passed in an overwhelming majority. The board members sat motionless, stripped not by force but by the collective will of those they once controlled. Their power, once absolute, dissolved beneath the weight of unity. The clipboard woman stood last. She did not speak. She did not protest. She simply picked up her clipboard, the symbol of her reign, and walked out quietly. Not as an enforcer, but as a relic. What followed was not instant peace, but immediate clarity. A temporary committee was formed, not to rebuild power, but to dismantle abuse. The first proposal was clear and unanimous. All pending fines related to non-essential violations were to be voided. The second, no future fines could be issued without full board approval and written justification. The third and most symbolic, a petition to amend the bylaws to protect homeowner autonomy, ensuring no structure or vehicle legally permitted by city code could be penalized by HOA preference alone. The enemy had become the example. His garage, once labeled an eyesore, became a monument. Not of rebellion, but of reform. Neighbors who once whispered now visited openly. Some came to thank him, some came to seek guidance. A few came just to marvel at what one man had built when pushed to his limit. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate loudly. He simply continued working inside the fortress he had forged from defiance. The truck that had started it all sat proudly within, not hidden in shame, but parked in victory. There were no more letters, no more warnings, no more clipboard patrols, but his fight would not end there. The website he had built was still growing. Stories poured in from across the country, neighbors fighting battles just like his. Some had lost. Some were still fighting. Some didn't know where to begin. He decided his story would not be the end. It would be the start. He expanded the site, added resources, legal templates, guides on how to document harassment, strategies for organizing community votes. contacts for attorneys specializing in HOA abuse. A network began to form, not of rebels but of homeowners reclaiming dignity. The monster garage had become more than a shelter. It had become a headquarters, not for war, but for balance. He didn't destroy the HOA system, he exposed it. He didn't burn down the house of control, he rewired it. And so, the street that once prided itself on silence learned the value of noise. The neighborhood that once worshipped uniformity learned the strength of difference. And the man who was fined for parking his truck learned that sometimes the only way to earn peace is to earn it loudly. The HOA had written its own downfall the moment it declared his presence a problem. He simply finished the story.